Before we get into any specific tactics, we need to lay a foundation of 3 very important rules. The first one is to establish your brand boundaries. Let me illustrate it this way. Let's say that within the box here, within these boundaries, is who you are, what you love to do, where your passion lies. This is what people might call your sweet spot. I want to draw a line around this and say inside this box is what I want to focus on as far as how I want others to perceive me. Outside of this box, and I left it with dashed lines because it's really open and endless, are other things. These are things that I don't want to be a part of my personal brand. When I was an IT manager, I loved to do things that had to do with developing web products. I was happy to do things that IT managers did, such as networking, LAN, WAN, speed issues, contingency plans, all of those things. I was interested in the strategic things, the tactical things. I wanted to be in on the meetings and know where the company was headed and how IT was going to have a big part of that. But the problem was I was always the IT person. And when you're the IT person, people think that you do everything. For example, even though I had defined to myself what my boundaries were, there were other things that people thought every IT person was good at or loved to do. You probably have experienced this very same thing. You've identified to yourself what your brand boundaries are, where your passion lies, but people come to you and say, hey, you're an IT person, right? Can you do this for me? For example, the CEO invited me to his house over lunch, saying that he would buy me lunch if I would help him hang his TV. I thought this was profound. It was a newer TV, and it was more technical than anything he had, and so he thought that this fell into the realm of IT manager. While I was good at doing the development that I did for websites, I was not necessarily skilled in hanging TVs, even though I was the IT manager. The CFO would regularly come to me back in the day of the Palm Pilot and say, hey, my Palm isn't synchronizing. Can you help me? Well, I didn't have a Palm. He didn't get one for me. I wasn't used to the technology. I wasn't in love with the technology. But because I was the IT person who knew how to pound a keyboard to make websites, surely I was somebody who knew how to make the synchronization work, right? Early in my career, I was in charge of backups in a server room. But as I got more into development, backups were handled by somebody else. Whether that was making a backup or restoring a backup, it wasn't my specialty or my passion. Have you had anybody come to you and say, hey, my speakers don't work, can you fix them for me? Or what about, can you fix my mouse? I love developing websites, but I really have a hard time with quality assurance. You know how it is. You spend a lot of time on your project and the last thing you want to do is spend a few hours making sure that you did it right. By the time you hand something over to QA, you're ready for a break from that project and let somebody else beat it up. One of the first hires I made when I started my own company was a quality assurance professional. I knew that I didn't want to do the QA. It's noble work and it's important work, but I knew that was outside of my own brand boundaries. I've also been accused at not being very good at graphics or UI. I'm okay with that. My specialties lie somewhere else, and I'd like to hire people or work with people who can complement what my own specialties are. And finally, I'm not the one to do the server upgrades. It's simply outside of my boundaries. Can you see what we're doing here? Inside your boundaries is where you're going to focus and you're going to let the other things go away. That might mean that you never talk about things like server upgrades, or it might mean that you explicitly say, I do this and this and this, but I don't do server upgrades. That's a different specialty or that's for someone else on my team. Here's the power of defining your brand boundaries. When you define your boundaries and everything within the boundaries, you are intentionally defining your personal brand and the characteristics of that brand. This is really good. This is what you want to do. The alternative is that if you don't intentionally define your personal brand, then you will be generalized, like I was when I was the IT manager, and I was generalized to be the guy to turn to all those things that I had on the previous screen. I didn't want to accept those stereotypes. I wanted to have a very specific definition of who I was and what I wanted to do. We went over this in the Career Management 2.0 course. If you haven't watched that course, I encourage you to check it out. That's where we talk about the complement of personal branding with the networking and nurturing relationships. Rule number 2 is that I don't want you to use any bad words in your branding. Now, of course, I don't want you to use any foul words or words that would be offensive to people, but when I talk about bad words in personal branding, I'm talking about 2 specific words. The first one is jargon. Jargon is something that means nothing to people outside of your circle. When I worked at a government organization, I found that they thrive on jargon. They love acronyms. If you've ever talked to somebody in the military and they talk as if you were in the military, you don't understand a thing they're talking about. They have a whole set of vocabulary just for people within their circle. When you talk to one of your colleagues about your specialty and they know what you're talking about, it's exciting and it's empowering to use the jargon. But when you're talking to other people, it can be very misleading or confusing. One of my favorite movie lines is from Denzel Washington when he's talking to somebody about a complex issue, and Denzel says, "Explain this to me like I'm a 6-year-old, okay?" There is a lot of power in this concept. When you're talking to somebody and you think they understand you, a problem could be that they don't understand you, so they're making assumptions, which could be wrong assumptions. But another problem is you're not allowing them or helping them to talk to other people about the issue. When you allow them to do the interpretation in their own mind, they might say it completely different to somebody else. If you communicate to people at a more simple level, they're going to be able to understand it without having to make those assumptions, and they'll be able to communicate that better to other people. This is a really powerful concept as you communicate what your brand is to other people. As an example, when you explain or list programming languages to non-programmers, they don't know what that means. JavaScript and Java, to somebody who's not in programming, sound like there's similarities, a lot of similarities. HTML, HTML5, CSS, these are things that we're very comfortable talking about, but when we use these terms with the wrong people, they are left to interpret and assume on their own. Keep the jargon low, especially if the audience is general. On the other hand, if you're talking at a conference and everybody in the room knows what CSS and HTML5 are, then it's okay to use those words and terms. But when you want to have people understand your brand, typically jargon is something you want to stay away from. The other bad word is cliché. Cliché refers to words and phrases that are overused that lose their meaning. For example, think about interviewing somebody for a job opening. Let's say in the job opening you said that they need to be a team player, have strong analytical skills, and be a strong communicator. Well, guess what? Everyone you interview is going to be a team player. If that's what the requirement, job description, or specs say, then everybody's going to say, oh, well, yeah, of course I'm a team player. Everybody's going to come in and say that they're analytical. If you're a programmer, you better be analytical. If you're in the IT space or a project manager, you have to be analytical. I assume that you're analytical. And whether you're a strong communicator or not, if it's the difference between getting a job or losing a job, you'll say, I'm a strong communicator, and you might even believe it. Be careful how you use certain words. If they're overused, if they're cliche, they might mean absolutely nothing. In the LinkedIn course on Pluralsight, I shared a tactic with how you can communicate your team player analytical or communication skills, and that's by using what I call mini stories. That's the problem, action, result. I'm a team player. For example, you state the problem, you talk about what you did as a team player, and then you talk about what the results were. Generally, don't use cliche words or terms unless you're going to put a mini story after them. The third rule is to make sure that you help your evangelists. Your evangelists are people who are talking about you to other people. They're spreading your brand to their networks. They might do it on social networking, they might do it in email, in a conference room, or speaking in front of a group of your peers. Evangelists spread the word about you. Until you help them with the right language, they will be guessing. You can only hope that they have a good assumption of what your brand is and that they have the right words to communicate that the right way. If they're using jargon, that's not going to do anybody any good. I encourage you to help them by taking the guesswork out of how they are talking about you. Give them the right words to use. These are words that might be in your tagline or your 30-second elevator pitch, on your business card, in your email signature. When you help them communicate your brand in a simple way, for example, to a 6-year-old, you're empowering them to help other people perceive you the right way. And if you can identify your evangelist, remind them who you are and what your branding statements are. Now, you're not going after them like a salesperson, and you're not doing this aggressively, but putting information in front of somebody one time isn't going to guarantee that they're going to get it, evangelize you the right way, and use the right words. You might have to put these words and phrases and testimonials in front of them regularly. When we talk about helping your evangelists, we're talking about empowering your evangelists. Can you imagine having 2 or 5 or 20 people in your industry talk about you with the right words and phrases? How powerful would that be? They can only do that if you help them.